London, August 1961. A single painting hangs alone in the National Gallery under glass, under guard. It is a portrait of a national hero, the Duke of Wellington, the man who broke Napoleon, painted by the Spanish master Goya. Weeks earlier, the British government paid a staggering sum to keep it in the country, £140,000, a fortune. Front page news. It has been on the wall for 19 days, and then, one morning, the wall is empty. No smashed glass, no cut wires, no alarm, no witnesses, nothing. The only painting ever stolen from the National Gallery in its entire history. And at that point, that history was 137 years long. Scotland Yard is certain of one thing. This is the work of elite international criminals, a syndicate, professionals who move like ghosts. They could not be more wrong. The man who took it is a 60-year-old disabled pensioner from Newcastle. He earns £8 a week. He has already been to prison once in his life, over a television set. He did not take it for money. He took it to declare war on his own government. And when they finally drag him into court, he will do the one thing nobody believes is possible. He will walk out of that courtroom a free man. So how does a broke, unwell old man beat the most secure gallery in Britain and then beat the British courts too? And why did the government bury the real truth of this case in a sealed file for the next 50 years? To understand the theft, you first have to understand the painting and why an entire nation lost its mind over it. Duke of Wellington around 1812, at the height of the war against Napoleon. Wellington was the man who would finally end the French emperor at Waterloo, a British god of war staring out of the canvas in his medals. The portrait wasn't just paint, it was national pride made physical. And in 1961, Britain nearly lost it. The painting came up for sale at Sotheby's, and the winning bid came from an American, Charles Wrightsman, a wealthy New York oil magnate and collector who intended to take it across the Atlantic and hang it in his private home. The idea that Wellington, the hero who saved Britain, would end up as a rich American's trophy caused a genuine public uproar. So the government stepped in. The state and a charitable foundation together found the money. That famous £140,000, slapped an export ban on the painting and rescued it for the nation. The newspapers cheered. The establishment congratulated itself. Britain had spent a king's ransom to keep one picture on one wall. And that decision, that exact sum of money, is the spark that lit everything that followed. Because there was a man watching all of this on a flickering television set in Newcastle, doing a very different piece of arithmetic. And what he was calculating would humiliate the entire British establishment. His name was Kempton Bunton, and he was, on paper, a nobody. 60 years old, a former bus driver, unwell, unemployed, overweight, scraping by on around £8 a week in a working-class corner of Newcastle. He was the kind of man the people who bought that painting would never notice, never meet, never think about for a single second. But Kempton Bunton had one burning obsession, and it was this: the television license. In Britain, then as now, you had to buy a license from the government simply to own a working television. A yearly fee, £4 at the time, that funded the BBC. For a comfortable family, an annoyance. For the poor, for the elderly, for pensioners, for old soldiers who had fought in the 2 world wars and now sat alone in cold rooms. That television was often their only company left in the world. And the state was fining them and even jailing them when they couldn't find the money to license it. Bunton thought this was a moral obscenity. He was also, in his spare time, a self-taught man who wrote plays nobody ever staged, a would-be author with a working man's fury and a strange gift for words that would soon terrorize Scotland Yard by post. He had campaigned for years to make TV licenses free for old-age pensioners. He wrote letters. He petitioned. He was ignored, again and again, by a government that couldn't be bothered to listen to an £8-a-week nobody from Newcastle. And here is how far he was willing to go. Bunton had already gone to prison over this cause. He had tampered with his own television so it could not receive the BBC's signal at all, arguing that if he didn't watch the BBC, he shouldn't have to pay the BBC's license. The state disagreed. They locked him up for it. So sit with the contrast that was burning a hole in this man's mind. A government that could conjure £140,000 overnight to save one painting, while it fined and imprisoned poor old veterans over a £4 television fee. To Kimpton Bunton, that wasn't a budget decision. It was a declaration of whose lives mattered, and he decided, alone, to do something about it. Something that had never been done in the entire history of the institution he was about to embarrass. The painting went on display on the 2nd of August, 1961, with great ceremony. Crowds came to see the rescued treasure. 19 days later, on the 21st of August, it was gone, and the reaction was instant, national, and completely wrong. This was the National Gallery, the beating heart of British art, in the middle of London in Trafalgar Square, a place that had never, not once in over a century of existence, lost a single painting to a thief. If someone could steal from here, they had to be extraordinary, brilliant, elite. The press ran wild. Scotland Yard mobilized. Every theory pointed to the same conclusion. This was the work of an international criminal syndicate, master art thieves, the sort of shadowy professionals who stole to order for secret collectors. Interpol was alerted. The nation braced for the ransom demand of a criminal mastermind. Everyone was looking up at some glamorous, invisible super criminal. Nobody thought to look down at a fat, ailing pensioner who had driven a borrowed car down from Newcastle, because the truth of how it was done was not brilliant at all. It was so simple, so stupid, so humiliating that when it finally came out, it would make the entire British security establishment look like fools. Here is what actually happened, and it is almost painful. The National Gallery had an expensive modern alarm system, infrared beams, invisible tripwires, the technology of the age. It should have been impregnable. But the thief had learned one small, fatal detail, the kind of thing a guard mentions without thinking. The costly alarm was switched off in the early hours of the morning. Why? So the cleaners could mop the floors without setting it off every 30 seconds. Every day, for a window of time before dawn, the most valuable room in British art was protected by nothing at all. That was the whole exploit. Not genius, not lockpicks, just a human habit, and a man who paid attention. The rest was almost comically low-tech. The night before, he had gone in as an ordinary visitor and quietly unlatched a small window in a men's toilet, leaving himself a way back in. He returned in the dead of night. He climbed over a brick wall at the back of the building, and there, left carelessly by builders doing work on the site, was a ladder. He simply used it. Up the ladder, through the toilet window he'd unlocked the day before, into the sleeping gallery where the alarm was already off, lifted the Duke of Wellington off its stand and walked back out the exact same way. No syndicate, no masterminds, a wall, a builder's ladder, an unlatched toilet window, and an alarm turned off for the cleaners. The fallout was brutal. The director of the National Gallery, Sir Philip Hindy, offered his resignation. The government launched an emergency review of security at every national museum in the country. The most secure gallery in Britain had been beaten by a 60-year-old pensioner and a ladder somebody else left lying around. But if you think stealing a priceless national treasure is the strangest part of this story, you have not heard what the thief did next. Because he didn't sell it. He didn't hide it. He started writing letters. This is the moment the case stopped being a robbery and became something the world had never seen. Kimpton Bunton began sending anonymous letters to the police and to the great news agency Reuters, and his demand was not what anyone expected from an art thief. He did not want the money for himself, not a penny of it. He demanded exactly £140,000, the very same sum the government had paid for the painting, and every bit of it was to be donated to a fund to pay the television licenses of the poor and the elderly. Give the pensioners their freedom, he said, and the Duke of Wellington comes home unharmed. He was, in his own mind, not a criminal at all. He was a man holding a hostage to force a heartless government to do the decent thing. His letters had a bitter, mocking eloquence. In one, he framed the whole act as an attempt to reach into the pockets of a public that, in his words, loved art more than it loved charity, that would spend a fortune on a painting of a dead general while living old soldiers went cold. He was rubbing the establishment's nose in its own hypocrisy, and he was enjoying it. And here is how enormous this story became. The stolen Wellington grew so famous, such a symbol of the perfect, impossible heist, that when the very first James Bond film, Dr. No, came out in 1962, the filmmakers put the painting in the villain's secret lair. A sly wink to the whole world. Of course, the greatest supervillain alive has the Goya nobody can find. The most wanted painting in Britain had become a movie punchline. Meanwhile, the real thief was not a supervillain. He was a pensioner sitting on the most famous painting in the country, unable to spend it, unable to sell it, waging a one-man propaganda war by post. And for 4 long years, the government refused to give in. So what does a man do when he's holding a priceless painting hostage and nobody will pay? What Bunton did next would finally put him in a courtroom and set up the greatest legal humiliation of all. By 1965, 4 years on, the standoff had gone nowhere. In his letters, he had even tried to bargain a way out, hinting he would hand the painting back if there were some promise of leniency, some assurance he wouldn't simply be locked away, and if his pensioners' fund were finally set up. The authorities would not deal. They would not create his charity, and they would not grant him any amnesty. And Bunton, it seems, had grown tired. So in May of that year, he did something extraordinary. He took the Duke of Wellington, the painting, Scotland Yard, Interpol, and the whole British press had hunted for 4 years, and he left it in a left luggage office at Birmingham's New Street railway station. A priceless national treasure checked in among the suitcases and parcels like a forgotten umbrella. Then he mailed the collection ticket to a newspaper, the Daily Mirror. The painting was recovered, undamaged after nearly 4 years missing. And still, nobody had any idea who was behind it. Then, 6 weeks later, Kempton Bunton simply walked into a police station and gave himself up. And this is where the police made their next mistake. They didn't believe him. They looked at the man in front of them, 61 years old, unwell, weighing well over 17 stone, and they could not accept that this wheezing pensioner had scaled a wall and squeezed through a toilet window to rob the National Gallery. It seemed physically impossible. It seemed absurd. But he confessed, and so they charged him, and they took him to the most famous criminal court in the world, the Old Bailey, expecting an easy conviction for one of the most sensational thefts of the century. What they didn't understand was that they had walked straight into a trap, because there was a hole in the law of England so wide you could carry a Goya through it, and Kempton Bunton was about to. Bunton's trial should have been a formality. He had admitted taking the painting. The whole nation knew it. Case closed. Except for one problem, and it was the problem that would rewrite British law. Under the law of the time, the Larceny Act of 1916, to convict a man of stealing something, the prosecution had to prove a very specific thing. Not just that he took it. They had to prove that he intended to permanently deprive the owner of it, that he meant to keep it, or sell it, or destroy it. To take something forever, that was the definition of theft. And Bunton had a brilliant barrister named Jeremy Hutchinson, one of the most celebrated defense advocates of the century, the man who had defended the publishers of Lady Chatterley's Lover and would go on to defend spies and scandal figures in the era's most notorious trials. Hutchinson played the loophole like a master. He stood up and made an argument that was technically unanswerable. His client, he said, never intended to keep the painting. He never tried to sell it. He never damaged it. He had, in his own strange way, only borrowed it, held it, temporarily, as leverage for a political cause, and then handed it back, safe and whole. And if a man always intended to give the thing back, then, under the letter of the law, he had not, in fact, stolen it at all. And it wasn't only the law working in Bunton's favor. It was the man himself. In the witness box, he was no criminal mastermind. He was a warm, rambling, self-mocking old man who cheerfully admitted the whole escapade and insisted again and again that he'd done it out of conscience and not for a single penny of gain. He told the court he'd only wanted to help the old and the poor. He was, by every account, impossible to dislike. Picture the scene the prosecution now faced, asking 12 ordinary Britons to send this gentle, broke pensioner to prison for embarrassing a government that jailed the elderly over their televisions. The jury listened, and the jury agreed. On the charge of stealing the Duke of Wellington, the priceless Goya, the national treasure, the painting that had humiliated Scotland Yard for 4 years, Kempton Bunton was found not guilty. He had taken the most famous painting in Britain, held it hostage for 4 years, confessed to the whole thing on the front pages, and legally, he had committed no theft. There was only one thing they could pin on him. When he returned the painting, he had returned the canvas, but not the ornate gold frame, which he admitted he'd thrown away and could not give back. And that frame, unlike the painting, he had meant to keep from its owner forever. So the only crime the British state could convict this man of after the theft of the century was stealing a picture frame. For that, and only that, he was sentenced to 3 months. A pensioner had taken on the entire establishment and won. But even that, the wall, the ladder, the ransom, the courtroom victory, was not the real secret of this case. The real secret sat locked in a government file, and it would not come out for 50 years. For half a century, Britain told itself a lovely story. The story of Kempton Bunton, the tubby, eccentric dreamer in the rumpled suit, the working-class Robin Hood who climbed a ladder and outwitted the whole country for the sake of poor pensioners. It became a national legend, a comedy, a folk tale. There was only one problem with the legend. It wasn't true. In 2012, under a Freedom of Information request, the National Archives finally released a confidential file that the Director of Public Prosecutions had kept sealed for decades. And inside it was the fact that changes everything. Kempton Bunton did not steal the painting. He physically could not have. A man of his age, his weight, his poor health, squeezing through a narrow toilet window and hauling himself up a ladder in the dark, it never really made sense. And it wasn't what happened. The person who actually climbed that ladder and lifted the Goya off the wall was his son, John Bunton, a fit man in his early 20s. And it gets darker. In 1969, years after the trial was over, John Bunton was arrested for a minor, unrelated offense. And, in the process, he confessed the truth, that he was the one who had really robbed the National Gallery. It was all there in the file. The authorities knew, and they did nothing. Now understand what the father had done. Kempton Bunton took the blame for a crime he did not commit, to do 2 things at once. First, to protect his young son from a serious prison sentence. And second, because he understood something ruthless and brilliant. A criminal trial, splashed across every newspaper in Britain, was the biggest platform he would ever get to scream his message about pensioners and television licenses to the entire nation. He didn't just take the fall. He weaponized it, and the government's choice is the true dirty laundry of this whole affair. Faced in 1969 with the knowledge that they had convicted the wrong man and let the real thief walk away, they decided to bury it. Because imagine the humiliation of admitting it. They had already been beaten by a ladder and an unlatched window. They had already lost the theft case in open court. To now confess that they'd prosecuted the wrong Bunton entirely, while the real one strolled free, it would have made the British justice system a laughingstock all over again. So they sealed the file, said nothing, and let the comfortable legend stand for 50 years. The old man protected his son. The state protected its own dignity, and the truth waited in the dark. But the establishment does not forgive being made a fool of. And even though Kempton Bunton walked free, his case left a wound in the law that Parliament could not leave open. Because he had proven, in front of the whole world, that under British law you could walk into a public gallery, take a priceless masterpiece off the wall, hold it hostage for years, and, as long as you claimed you always meant to give it back, commit no theft at all. It was an unacceptable hole, so Parliament closed it. In the Theft Act of 1968, they added a specific new provision, a clause making it a criminal offense to remove any object on public display, whether or not you ever intended to keep it forever. The exact loophole Bunton drove a Goya through was bricked up, deliberately, because of him. A broke pensioner from Newcastle had forced an empire to rewrite its laws. And there is a last irony he did not live to see. Decades after his death, the government quietly did the very thing he had gone to war for, granting free television licenses to the country's oldest penetrators. He was right all along. It just took Britain 40 years to admit it. In 2020, his story finally reached the screen as The Duke, with Jim Broadbent playing the old man who took on the state and won. The government spent a fortune to save a painting and jailed the poor over a television set. So one of them stole the painting back, and the only thing they could ever prove he took was the frame.